Hello everyone, welcome to the SMITE Comprehensive Guide to Cabrakan. This is a one-off request by Diego Vargas Salas, so I'm going to take a brief detour here and talk about Cabrakan in the support role, because that is the request. Again, if I mispronounced your name, I apologize, but let's talk Cabrakan. Now, one of the interesting things about Cabrakan is he is one of 3 supports that I'm actually still comfortable building the old Aura bot style on, right? When I play support Cabrakan, I always am busting out Sentinel's Gift, because late game I want to be busting out Sentinel's Embrace. It is incredibly useful when combined with his passive, which provides allies basically 5% reduced damage from, everything, plus the extra protections that I'll be providing them via Sentinel's Embrace can be really meaningful. Even with 5 allies nearby, only getting 16 protections each, it's that 5% plus that little bit of extra protections can still really make a difference. But you might be wondering, Professor, Gauntlet of Thebes, isn't that a little slow? It is. Actually, it's a little slow for Cabrakan, especially because Cabrakan has a tendency to accidentally kill people. Now let's talk minions for a really hot second, right? I don't know why I reset cooldowns here. So when you're level 1 Cabrakan, right? And let's bring this down to here, right? And we'll bring this down to here. And then you're gonna be wandering in. This is too high, there we go. And here we are. We're doing this damage to the minions. It was a lovely time. They're clustered up, great for your ally. Right? 20 gold, 18 gold, whatever. Yup, that's a lovely time. Woohoo. So, what happens now, right? So, eventually we're going to wind up going up to our next couple of levels. 1, get the Refracted Shield. Second one, get the Seismic Crush. And then we're going to say, it's been what, 9 minutes? 6 minutes? 6 minutes. Now, at this point, we're busting out this, right? You can see where now we're still doing. There's a lot of things. If we let the full tremors run, we're going to wind up killing the whole wave. Even if we don't increase our tremors, right? We're going to run back in here really quick and grab some increased mana. Now we're level 4, we're 9 minutes in. We didn't increase our tremors, but we're still doing substantial amounts of damage to this minion wave. Now, if our allies aren't able to do enough damage, say your ally pops off their ability first, and you start tremoring afterwards, you're going to kill those minions, right? Unless you stop, in which case you're stopping your tremor. You've already started pulling the minion aggro, you've already gotten hit because you're standing still for that. It's very risky to do. Besides the fact you're still possibly going to accidentally kill minions, and even if you're using, Refraction Shield, which is what I recommend you level first in most Cabrakan situations, boom, you're doing a decent amount of damage to this front line here. You can see where I took maybe about a quarter, maybe of their life, maybe a little less. Maybe I would actually say maybe a fifth would be more accurate. But back here, that is like a third, right? At the end of the day, if your ally isn't throwing down some serious wave clear before you get there, before you're primed to help out, then you're going to have a really rough time not killing minions. Now, you're going to say, well, Professor, just stand back and let your ally deal with that. Sometimes that's going to be possible, but sometimes not. If the enemy laning opponents are there, then the enemy support, who probably isn't building Gauntlet of Thebes unless they have a very specific plan or they're Ganesh, they, without any fear, are going to go on ahead and accidentally kill a couple of those minions, and they're going to clear a little faster because it's going to be your ADC or mid lane ally solo clearing against 2 enemies who are both clearing, right? So if there's no enemies in lane, yeah, that's fine. Stand back, let your damage dealer kill the whole wave. 6 stacks. Enemies in lane, enemies clearing your wave, you gotta participate. Whether this be trying to prevent the enemy from attacking or whatever, you're still gonna be drawing minion aggro, right? Even if... Okay, let's do a hypothetical, right? The time doesn't matter. Let's say I'm trying to, we have a pretty standard lane situation. The enemy ADC is, somewhere about back here because this is where they're going to shoot the front line, let's say. Right, and I'm over here, I'm, attacking them, and then I start using tremors. I'm just by default pulling in these minions. Right? Even if I'm trying not to actively attack the minions, because of the area that tremors covers, I can't help but damage them. And if your laning ally isn't capable of at least wiping out the back line, which is the minimum you need them to be able to solo clear in a single ability, then you're going to wind up stealing a lot of minion kills. And again, this isn't necessarily by itself a problem. The problem here comes in the form of trying to build stacks on Thebes. As a result, very, very often you will find yourself only getting approximately 3 to 4 stacks per wave unless your laning ally has what is known as a line clear. I'm talking needs Spirit Arrow, Ra's Beam that I can't remember the name of, Izanami's auto attacks, or her Ghost projection. I'm talking about Poseidon's Tidal Wave, where he throws the wave out there. Right, I'm talking about abilities like this that go in a straight line, reach the back line, and deal damage to it. Your ally needs to be able to have one of these abilities and have that ability do enough damage to clear the back line. Now, people building damage is rarely a problem. So it really comes down, whether or not I'm comfortable building Gauntlet of Thebes is going to come down to the basic question of, does my allied ADC and mid lane both have line clear abilities? For mid lane, that answer is usually going to be yes. Most mages have really great line clear, or an ability close enough to line clear. Chang'e, for instance, doesn't have line clear, but because of the way her abilities move, she actually can clear the wave relatively effectively. And, a Heimdall is an interesting case because his sword, which is technically his wave clear, does cover a large enough area to theoretically hit both the front and back line in a standard setup like this, right? If I were to allow these two to meet, Heimdall can theoretically hit all of the minions situated like so. What if something happens where the back line is out of whack? Maybe I do this and the back line is slightly pushed back, and he happens to throw his sword at that exact moment. He's missing 2, maybe all 3 of those archers, right? So Heimdall is a risk, and I don't usually build Gauntlet of Thebes when I'm laning with a Heimdall, specifically because while he could clear that whole wave, he might not. And taking Hachiman as a specific example, Hachiman's War Flag cannot hit the whole wave, except in extremely specific circumstances. And you might be thinking to yourself, well, Professor, your Tremors pulls in the minions, so allies should be able to, hit those circle abilities. Yes, but if those circle abilities aren't hitting hard enough to clear the wave, guess who's going to clean up those minions and not get the assist stacks for their Gauntlet of Thebes? Yeah. So, that's really where whether or not you can get away with Gauntlet of Thebes comes from. Generally speaking, given the current meta, I don't build it that often anymore. Again, primarily because the way the meta works, primarily due to the risks involved, it's not something I commonly build. I need to go up my level here. So, I still build a lot of the time Sentinel's Embrace, I'm still building Sovereignty a lot. I'm building Manticore's Spike as my 3rd item in most situations because of this really fascinating combo. We're not going to use, Ymir as an example. We're going to use Neath because it's a bit easier to see. So, here's the combo with Manticore Spike specifically. I'm going to deliberately trigger her because under normal circumstances, they're already going to be shooting you, right? I'm going to run back here. I'm approaching her with Seismic Toss, right? I pick up my Manticore Spike, one of these here. There we go. Hit her with the Refraction Shield, which is going to drop another Manticore Spike. You can see it there. Even if they have a stun or a silence, that first tick of the tremors is still going to hit, so I'm still going to be hitting that damage. And then boom, seismic back up, boom, refraction is back up. I hit that too early, but that's fine. We can still finish her off with regular auto attacks. And I might be saying to the professor, that Neith has no items. Of course you're going to kill her pretty quick. No, that has actually nothing to do with my ability to kill her. Most ADCs aren't building protections or health. They might get 100 health off of Toxic Blade. Possibly they're building Death's Toll and getting 75 health off of that. If they're fully evolving that, that's, I think, 200 to 300 health depending on which version you take. So maybe they can get tops 400 or so health from items in most builds, but a vast majority of Hunter ADCs and even Magic ADCs aren't building any protections. They aren't really building health. As a result, it's very often that you can get away with that. So that amount of damage and that kill time is pretty close to what you would find in a real-life situation. The only real difference is, do they have lifesteal, right? And that's a conversation about anti-healing. But at that early in the game with only 3 items each, they're not going to have a ton of lifesteal in most cases, so you can still probably get away with that. But you could see, because I have 2 stuns, I get 2 spikes and get to do that twice. And this is one of the reasons why people refer to Cabrakan as Cabroken. He has 2 stuns, which is very powerful given that most gods only have one form of hard crowd control. And what's particularly fun, what I don't really see anyone talking about, is because most gods in the game have only one form of hard crowd control, if that. Some just don't have any at all. But because they only have the one form of hard crowd control, it's really easy to bait that out and deliberately absorb that with Cabrakan, because when you bust out Tremors, people panic. Alright, Tremors is interesting because it moves the enemy around. You can actually see that, right, whenever you're fighting against even bots here, because to some extent you can see her kind of going in a circle because she's trying her best to actually control the forced motion of Tremors. She always has to move, she's just trying to control that motion. And in a real combat scenario with players, not bots, those players aren't going to be able to control that emotion as well, because they're going to be looking at what, their enemies are doing, your allies, in other words. They're going to be looking at what their allies are doing, they're going to be trying to, do all these things, and they're not really going to be trying, they're not going to be paying attention enough to try to control the motion of Tremors. In fact, that's the only thing in this game that bots are better at than humans, is dealing with the Tremor effect. Fun fact. Anyways, back to the point. A lot of enemies are going to just immediately turn and either stun or silence you out of this. But because again, just a reminder, most gods only have one form of hard crowd control, once they hit you with that, then they have no way of stopping your allies from killing them. And furthermore, there are ways you can really take advantage of this extreme tendency of enemies to stun or silence you out of Tremors. There are 2 items I really like building, and I build them very often on Cabrakan. My personal favorite is Spirit Robe, for a couple of reasons. First, it's giving me 10% cooldowns. Second, it's giving me 40 of each protection. Third, it's giving me 20% crowd control reduction, which also affects the non-hard crowd controls, which is really nice. So it's just going to be more generally useful, broadly speaking. Furthermore, whenever I am hit by hard CC, like a stun or a silence, I am going to receive an additional 15 damage mitigation. Add on my 5% reduced damage in general for my passive, and I'm taking roughly 20% less damage. Now, the actual way that stacks is a little different. It's not a full 20%, but it's really damn close. But this also is capable of being triggered every 15 seconds. In other words, every 2 Tremors. Right? And mind you, this is just 10% cooldown. It's every 3 Tremors if you have more cooldowns. Every 2 to 3 Tremors, I basically get increased 15% damage mitigation, right? So I generally tend to build Spirit Robe, but if the enemy team has Fenrir or Atlas, for example, someone who can pull you away, Bastet's another great example of this. Instead of building Spirit Robe, I will build Magi's Cloak, very specifically Magi's Shelter. Whenever your passive is consumed, the nearest allied god within 40 units gains protections from a single hard CC for 8 seconds. If this passive is consumed before the time runs out, they gain an additional 1 second of crowd control immunity. In In other words, whenever I bait out the enemy's hard crowd control, one of my allies gets to be immune to CC for 8 or 9 seconds. My only real issue with this is this happens once every 70 seconds, which is a really long time. This is similar to my criticism of Mail of Renewal. And in fact, I only use Magi's Shelter in the very specific context of Fenrir, Atlas, or Bastet existing. In all other situations, I am in fact busting out Spirit Robe because, broadly speaking, it is more useful. But either way, you can make that response of enemies to target you with hard CC to stop your tremors. You can turn that into an advantage. You can turn that into something that works in your favor in most scenarios. Okay? And I am really fond of doing that. I will bust out tremors just as an effort to bait out hard crowd control. And very often, in large team fights, it's not too unusual for multiple enemies to hit you with whatever crowd control they happen to have. I have, in fact, very often baited out such smaller forms of crowd control, such as roots or slows, at the same time, just by happenstance, by people looking really desperately to try to stop me from tremoring. Okay, they're just throwing out whatever they can. Roots are very common, right? And that is, in fact, something that I don't see enough Cabrakan players doing. I don't see them building Spirit Robe or Magi's Cloak when they really should be, because you can literally trick the enemy into wasting their hard CC on you and thereby give your allies basically free reign to do whatever they want for the next 10 to 15 seconds, depending on the cooldown of that ability that provided the hard CC, right? And of course, Tremors, as I stated before, has a 7.2 second cooldown. There's not a whole lot of abilities that stun or silence that have that short of a cooldown, right? So you're likely only going to be stopped every other tremor as well. Unless the enemy team is actually planning out their hard CC, which most don't, let's be honest. My next item that I very often like to build, and I don't know why it's not in my build, I keep forgetting to put it in for some reason, is Pridwin. Because guess what? It's really easy to stay really close, to stick really close to an enemy. I bust out my ult here, I'm going on ahead and I'm living life, and then, I've got all of this going on, I've got all these stuns, and lo and behold, I have just dealt large quantities of damage to me here, and call it a day, right? Okay. Right, so that's really useful as well. Furthermore, another nice benefit of Pridwin is you do have that health shield before it explodes, so you can actually use that to kind of soften any blows you receive while using Tremors after the fact as well. You throw down your... Because a lot of combos, a lot of people also... I did it with the Manticore Spike triggers, but it's not too unusual for people to go through this process. We go ahead and Seismic Strike, get the Manticore Spike. I should have reduced my cooldowns for this, hold on. Whoops. Let's reset this cooldown. Boom. I know I already had the cooldowns off, but at this point it didn't really matter. So what you would want to normally do, we run in here, Seismic Strike, we grab our Manticore Spike, we use our ult, and then we're going to start using Tremors right afterwards. And this, I have my health shield there. You've noticed I just am now starting to take damage. You finish off with the Refraction Shield combo, the Wombo combo, it's a done deal, right? Again, Pridwin is incredibly useful on a support Cabrakan. Notice that despite this, all this damage I'm able to bring to bear, I'm still really tanky. In fact, I've actually overcapped my physical protections in this particular instance, but that's whatever. If you're really fond of the idea, you can also throw on Mystical Mail instead. Just as an aside. Also really incredibly effective because, again, you are able, like I just proved with Pridwin, you're really able to stick onto enemies. So Mystical Mail is really nice. I don't tend to build Mystical Mail on support Cabrakan, but we'll be talking about that a little bit later. But I do like Sovereignty. Again, Sovereignty is assuming a 3 physical, 2 magic comp as usual, but, I do like Pridwin. Something else I am really fond of building as well is Spear the Magus, because, again, we're looking at the ability to trigger that spear on all of your abilities. Boom. We have this... Manticore Spike. Give me my Manticore Spike. There it is. Boom, we're going to ult. We're going to get our Pridwin up here. We're going to go on ahead and blast you with this. Backflipped away from that. Good play. But, you know, I've got all this increased damage from Spear the Magus. I do like Spear the Magus. I usually build Spear the Magus quite often because it is increasing the damage taken from all sources, including Manticore's Spike and Pridwin. If the enemy team is unusually tanky, which sometimes happens, instead I will go for the delightful Soul Reaver, but I want to warn you of something. This is not well known. I want you to observe the numbers on, very specifically, did you see that 13? That was Soul Reaver, right? And notice that there's just the Tremor damage now at this point. There is no additional Soul Reaver damage. Soul Reaver only procs once on Tremors, right? Now, Spear the Magus will proc once on every person in that Tremors, right? So if somebody wanders into Tremors after the fact, a lot of the cases they'll be wandering into it to stun or silence you. Ganesh is a great example of someone who has to physically get close to you to stop you from using it. They're going to at least trigger that Spear the Magus on themselves first, assuming it's within the 15-second time period. But while you're baiting out the enemy's hard crowd control, very often you can get away with also slapping a Spear the Magus passive on them and increase the damage they're taking from allies. Just be aware that Soul Reaver only procs once per enemy with the Tremors, so just kind of keep that in mind. You can also build Polynomicon. However, the problem with this really is that you generally, at least as a support Cabrakan, we're just going to go on ahead and finish her off really quick here so you can get a better example. Yeah. Now, when you actually use Polynomicon, observe my damage output here, boom, right? That was an additional, like, 48, I think. 135. Yeah, the 135 is the Manticore Spike or whatever. But it's really not that big of a deal. Because boom, okay, we've just activated Polynomicon. Boom, 48 bonus damage. And that 48 bonus damage is very specifically because he has such low power. So Polynomicon isn't something I build on support Cabrakan. It used to be better on him, back when Polynomicon itself was a little stronger. And it was a must-buy on him for the longest time, but nowadays, it's really not all that. I prefer at this point Spear the Magus because it is going to boost my ability damage, it's going to boost the Manticore Spike damage, it's going to boost the Pridwin damage. It's a lovely time, right? Another really interesting thing you can run, if you're really feeling it, I build this often whenever I'm playing Cabrakan in Assault, but you could also trigger a really interesting series of Soul Gem procs very easily. If I didn't miss my ult, boom, right, and then boom, blast of healing for all of my allies. Right, unfortunately, just like with Soul Reaver, Soul Gem does not proc multiple times for one Tremors, which is a bit unfortunate. But again, anybody who wanders into that is going to give you a stack of that. But generally speaking, I am going to prefer the use of Spear the Magus. You can see even with that splash of damage item, I still have incredibly high protections across the board, right? It's a really lovely time. And this is, again, very often how I'm building Cabrakan. Now you might be concerned a little bit about my 237 magic protections here, but in a lot of situations, most mages these days aren't building a ton of penetration. In fact, most mages will usually average about 20% penetration, 10% from Rod of Tahuti, 10% from Warlock Staff. Right? Some people build Typhon's Fang instead of Rod of Tahuti. Some people will additionally build, you know, Typhon's Fang. I tend to build Typhon's Fang instead of Warlock Staff, but most mages are going to be sitting at around a 20% penetration limit, just because of the itemization of mages and how it is right now. That's not really a big deal, in all honesty. I don't need to be blasting so far past 200 that I'm concerned about it. This is generally how I approach most of my Cabrakan builds as a support Cabrakan. Again, Sovereignty will be swapped out for Heart Ward. Sometimes if my team composition is correct, namely the mid and the ADC, sometimes I'll bust out full Orobot. It depends on the enemy team comp, it depends on my team comp. I tend to go more Orobot. I'm more likely to go Orobot if the enemy team does more damage than usual. Say their solo laner is an assassin instead of a warrior, as an example. That might merit Orobotting. But this is generally how I'm going to be approaching Cabrakan in a lot of situations. There really isn't too much in terms of changes. Sometimes if the enemy team is particularly physical dominant, they've got 4 or 5 physical damage dealers, I'll build Breastplate of Valor. Again, it doesn't happen terribly often. If they have 4 or 5 magic damage dealers, I'll go on ahead and build Bulwark of Hope. Or if I have enough mages on my team, I'll build Voidstone, because that's also very effective on Cabrakan. Again, he can stick very close to enemies very easily. But let's talk about solo lane Cabrakan, since that is a really interesting conversation. It's not my favorite way of playing him, right? If I'm going to be playing him, I'm usually going to go either Vampiric Shroud if I'm confident my laning opponent is physical, or Sands of Time if not. Alright? And I build very similarly, in all honesty, with the sole exception of building Mystical Mail as my second item. So let's go with... I'm going to assume my laning opponent is physical. Again, if my laning opponent is not physical or I'm unsure, I'm going Sands of Time. But let's say Vampiric Shroud, we go Mystical Mail. Now, I've long advocated against Mystical Mail as a general rule in the solo lane because it forces you to give up control of when the minions poke you. However, because Tremors is such a large ability, you're pretty much almost guaranteed to be pulling minion aggro anyways as a solo laner, right? It's pretty much guaranteed. You all, just by being Cabrakan and using Tremors, you're basically asking for minion aggro by default, right? So it doesn't really make a difference at all for you to not build Mystical Mail. And Mystical Mail, even if my laning opponent isn't necessarily physical, it's just so potentially powerful a lot of the times that, you know, you're absolutely fantastic. Let's even assume, for the sake of argument, that I'm against a magic opponent. I would still typically build Mystical Mail first because I'm just looking to overwhelm my opponent with damage at that point. Furthermore, due to the simple fact, and the Mystical Mail damage is going to be a bit skewed because I'm level 20 here, but, you know, most of your single target damage is not even in Tremors. So unless your laning opponent has, you know, some form of hard crowd control, you can just go on ahead and do this the whole time, right? And then stun them as needed. You can see, again, I have not much damage here, but boom, there she goes, right? Now, obviously, an enemy warrior would have a bit more protections than that, but again, you're, you know, really quickly wiping out the enemy minion wave with the combination of Tremors and Mystical Mail. Remember, Tremors pulls enemies towards you slightly as well, so the enemy minions are going to naturally be closer to you, and you can really combine that nicely with Mystical Mail in the solo lane to ensure that you're pulling all those minions in and killing them, right? Then you start boxing the enemy with Refraction Shield and Seismic Slam. It's a beautiful time. My next item, as you probably assumed, good old Manticore Spikes. Right? Absolutely delightful time. And again, I actually build very similarly. I don't really make much in the way of changes here for my support build. My starter item is different, obviously. And I'll still usually go for Spear of the Magus in a lot of situations, because even if I evolve this, I'm not necessarily going Pendulum of the Ages. I'm often going the Ultimate Timeline as a solo laner. Sometimes if my jungler is doing really terribly, I'll go with Pendulum of the Ages. If I do go with this, for whatever reason, I will actually build Polynomicon, because it's actually going to be a bit more damage. It's actually going to mean something in terms of damage output, right? You can actually get yourself a decent bit of damage out of Polynomicon in this situation if you decide to build Pendulum of the Ages. Again, for me, it really depends. If the enemy team is particularly tanky, or even as tanky as average, yeah, I can totally see myself doing that, right? And again, I just built, I just did, boom, a nice 144 bonus damage on that auto attack, right? And then 27 damage with, obviously, the level 20 boost from Mystical Mail, but I did 120 odd damage with that Polynomicon, which isn't bad at all. So if you're building Pendulum of the Ages for whatever reason you decide, absolutely fantastic, go for Polynomicon. If you're building the alternate timeline, go with Spirit of the Magus instead, or alternatively Soul Reaver. Both are going to serve you better than Polynomicon can. But I actually do sometimes use this in the context of a solo lane Cabrakan. Okay, now let's talk about the final version of Cabrakan that I like to play, and that would be very specifically Jungle Kraken with Jungle Cabrakan. I typically build Boomba's Dagger. Now, a lot of people are going to be like, well, you could instead build the Eye of the Jungle and go into, say, Protector of the Jungle, which is going to give you increased power and protections. Yes, but I really don't just use regular auto attacks with the Cabrakan that often, and of course, because of that, Seer of the Jungle isn't going to do me much good either. But what Boomba's Dagger offers me as a jungle Cabrakan is eventually Boomba's Hammer. Now, for most junglers, I don't like Boomba's Hammer. But for Cabrakan, due to the fact that he's a Guardian and typically does a little bit less damage anyways, you get this really lovely, and you can actually see it right here with Godbots. You can see the trigger right down there. Boom. Bonus 70 damage, right? And that's just an absolutely lovely design. Boom. And of course you fight as normal because that only triggers, you know, every so often. They've actually removed what the cooldown timer is on that, and I can't remember off the top of my head. I think if you can't take a certain amount of, I think you can't take damage for a certain amount of time. I can't quite remember off the top of my head. But anyways, Boomba's Hammer is really nice for that specific reason. Again, you are looking at a character that doesn't typically necessarily do high amounts of damage, right? And then typically what I will run as Cabrakan is, in a lot of cases, Charon's Coin. Now, why is this? And I'm still, you know, kind of reacquainting myself a little bit with Jungle Cabrakan. I'll talk about this more in the future. I'm testing some things out, but recently I've been running Charon's Coin for a number of very specific reasons. The biggest of which is Charon's Coin offers me 20 MP5 right off the bat and will give me movement speed as time goes on. Now, it's no secret that Cabrakan, being a Guardian, is a little bit slower than average on base movement speed. Sure, Seismic Slam does boost my movement speed, absolutely, and that is lovely. But we also have to confront the fact that most assassins are going to be faster than him by default, so I need that boosted movement speed to help me out in that particular aspect. Furthermore, another great benefit of Charon's Coin, as I specifically mentioned before, is the 20 MP5. Now, when you're playing with a... when you're playing support Cabrakan, you're getting mana back via Sentinel's Gift. If you're playing solo lane Cabrakan, you're either getting that mana back through Vampiric Shroud or through Sands of Time. Boomba's Dagger is okay for mana restoration, at least for the early game. But if you're going to be keeping up with the enemy using, very specifically, good old Seismic Slam as your go-to method of increased move speed, that's going to cost you a lot of mana very quickly, so you need more MP5. Charon's Coin not only gives me that movement speed that I'm looking for, but it begins with the MP5, and later on in the game, I don't have to worry about building magic pen, you know, any pen. Right, I already have 20% right here. Right? Now, at this particular point, I will also typically go into Polynomicon as my next item. Then maybe I'll go into Bancroft's Talon. Now, something else you can do, and this is also equally as effective in some ways, is instead of Charon's Coin, which gives you less damage with the penetration in the MP5, you can go into Bancroft's Talon, which does run a little bit of a risk, because now, while you do have increased max mana, and you have much more power with this, especially as you start dying, you are... Actually, let's unevolve this really quick. You are now looking at lower baseline movement speed. You're not looking at as much mana regeneration, right? That can be very difficult. Typically, I'll still go Polynomicon, and then at this point, if I'm going to be doing it this way, at this particular point, then I'll run Charon's Coin. Or Doom Orb. I have been known to use Doom Orb as well. Doom Orb is a great option, but I typically like to go Charon's Coin as my fourth item, And they're, again, we're coming back to the desire for movement speed. Fourth item is about when I like to start building penetration, or at least start thinking about it. So from a jungling perspective, that's not a bad time to start building your pen, right? Because it's about at that point that enemies are going to get substantially tankier. You know, so tanky that you're not just going to be able to punch through just building raw power anymore. And then I like to build Typhon's Fang. That's going to be 30% penetration. When we move up to Boomba's Dagger, we're not going to get any benefits there. 30 penetration is fine, though. I just want to remind you that it's Boomba's Spear that has the 10% pen, not Boomba's Hammer. Sometimes I myself forget. I almost forgot there, but I remembered a bit before this. But I want to remind you, yeah, Boomba's Spear is the one with the increased penetration. And if you prefer Boomba's Spear over, Boomba's Spear over Boomba's Hammer, that's fine. I just prefer Boomba's Hammer on Cabrakan specifically. He's one of the very few junglers that I do. But anyways, Typhon's Fang, 30% pen total here. We get a nice boost in our power and our lifesteal. We grab Bancroft's Claw at this point, which is a really lovely time specifically on him because we have a nice high baseline HP from just being Guardian, and then we have the increased, power as well. It's just a really great time. And then as my final item, what I wind up building is going to depend. Sometimes it's Divine Ruin, if I need the anti-healing. Sometimes it's Spear the Magus, if I want the extra damage on squishies. I have been known to build Soul Gem sometimes, because if you'll actually look at my total lifesteal here, nice Odins, you'll see that I am not quite capped on this. Obviously, when I'm low on health with Bancrofts, I would be closer to being up that high. But generally speaking, it is going to be Spear the Magus or Soul Reaver. Again, if I need anti-healing, it'll be Divine Ruin. Okay? So there is that going on. Now, I forgot to actually mention with the support Cabrakan, because you're probably wondering this, and I realized just now that I forgot to mention this. When I'm support Cabrakan, and I build my usual, you will notice a Professor. Where the hell is your anti-healing as Cabrakan? Well, again, I will usually build Divine Ruin as my last item if I need that instead of Spear the Magus. I prefer Spear the Magus. Spear the Magus is great. Right, actually, I'm just gonna go ahead and show you the whole way through. I keep forgetting that I put this in here. But I'll usually bust out Divine Ruin. Now, why is this, right? Again, this comes back to my argument on a lot of anti-healing. Divine Ruin provides me with more anti-healing than Pestilence or Contagion do. That's 25% less healing, which is great and all. But with all of Cabrakan's abilities dealing damage, you can very consistently maintain the anti-healing of Divine Ruin. Especially when we're talking about, this here. We can, for example, slam her here. She's going to do that. We're going to go on ahead and hit her with this. You can see those purple lines around her where she is constantly anti-healed the whole time. And the interesting thing is, she's only just now going to lose the anti-healing effect right here, right? Even though for Soul Reaver and Soul Gem, those only proc once per tremor, Divine Ruin is proccing every single inflicted damage. I'm not sure why, but there it is. So, for Cabrakan, you can actually simulate a stronger version of the Pestilence and Contagion anti-healing by basically running Divine Ruin and just trying to make Tremors last as long as possible. Again, you are going to be cancelled out of that some of the time, but also keep in mind that you're running 30-ish% cooldowns. You have a 5-second okay, it's basically a 6-second cooldown on Tremors. That's still not a long amount of time, right? Here we go with this. Less than 6 seconds later, Tremors is back up. And again, most abilities that involve hard crowd control have a much longer cooldown than that. Most of them are 10 to 15 seconds overall. Even Refraction Shield itself only will have a 7-second cooldown, and that's a conditional stun. You need to fulfill the conditions of that first, right? Look at Seismic Crush. That's barely under 10 seconds right here. It's 9.8. It's only 0.2 seconds under 10 seconds for 1 second stun duration, right? That's fairly common amongst hard crowd control abilities. So you're going to, again, only be stopped basically every other Tremors. So every other Tremor is going to be just this sustained anti-healing. So whenever I do need anti-healing as a support Cabrakan, I am reaching immediately for Divine Ruin. If I don't need anti-healing, I'm usually reaching for Spear the Magus. Okay? Finally, again, if the enemy team is really tanky, I'm reaching for Soul Reaver. But this is generally how I like to build for Cabrakan in a lot of situations, right? This is generally how I approach Cabrakan in most games. Just a lot of potent damage output. A lot of these things I build pretty consistently across the board. Again, the only time I really build heavy on the damage is Boombas when I'm playing Jungle Cabrakan. And like I said, there are two really viable ways of starting it off. I have a mild preference for Charon's Coin, but I'm finding through testing, and this is actually what I was testing earlier. Not like earlier today, like earlier a week ago. But earlier I was testing it, and I'm discovering that Bancroft is a little bit of a stronger choice in the current meta than Charon's Coin is. But Charon's Coin still is a good option. It's just not the ideal option. But that's going to come down to your preference and playstyle. If you're a bit more of an aggressive player, Charon's Coin might do you more good, because as a more aggressive player, you're going to be able to stack that Charon's Coin a little bit faster. I'm a bit more of a safer player. Again, this comes from my background as a long-time support main, right? Where I tend to, think about my moves for a little bit before going in and, blinking in or whatever. Be that as it may, a more aggressive player probably would find Charon's Coin a little bit more useful, because they would be more likely to stack that faster. So, but ultimately that's going to come down to your own personal decisions. But that is how I approach building Cabrakan, and some things that you should probably keep in mind when going to build Cabrakan. Again, Cabrakan can bring to bear a large amount of damage regardless of the role he's playing, simply due to the unholy combination of Manticore Spikes and Pridwin, combined with his naturally increased defense via his passive and his large amount of damage-dealing abilities that allow him to take advantage of this, as well as his 2 stuns, something that is very unusual in this game. So next episode, I will be doing Cabrakan in the support role, and talking about what I'm building, why I'm building it, but you'll see something very similar to the build that I currently have. Probably Spirit the Magus instead of Divine Ruin, but that depends on the enemy's healing. But what I'll be building will be very similar to this build that I have here. Okay? So with that being said, thank you all very much for joining me. If you like this, please like and subscribe. If you didn't, please ignore me. And if you have any comments, questions, concerns, ideas, suggestions, or requests, please leave them down in the comment section below. And thank you all very much for joining me, and have a great 24 hours.